Hey, happy Friday. This is Elijah, the head of your CMC, and I wanted to share with you this short paper by the philosopher Alasdair McIntyre called What is Ethics to Learn from Medical Ethics? Do you hear that right? What is ethics to learn from medical ethics, not the other way around? So McIntyre splits this paper up into five parts that I hope to summarize for your contemplation. So McIntyre sets the stage like this. Why reflect on ethics and the seemingly much smaller medical ethics? The former is taught in every academic institution, while the latter might normally be confined within medical schools, if taught at all. In McIntyre's words, it seems that the philosophers are the blood donors, the physicians, surgeons, and patients are the ones badly in need of a transfusion. He disagrees and argues otherwise. Part 1. Here he describes the relevant features of the crises in medicine. Keep in mind, this is 1978, but I think it's quite relevant today. The mortality of major infectious conditions such as TB in 1900 was 40%. Major chronic conditions, however, like heart disease, cancer, and stroke, only under 20%. In 1978, this drastically shifts, where infectious mortality sits at 6%, with 58% for chronic conditions. But with this part of medical history comes a kind of identity crisis and shift. He says it was natural to think of the physician as an applied scientist, thinking about like battling TB or diphtheria. This understanding the physician's role is contrasted from the nurse, the public health official, and the moralist. So, briefly, the nurse back then carried out the physician's instruction to help the physician do his job more efficiently. The public health official may care about, I guess, in our country's context, the origin and incidence of schistosoma in this specific province, but the physician, again, pre 1973, had no concern with social structures. Finally, the physician could, as a private person, give his moral advice, but acting as a physician, he was no more concerned than a biochemist. For McIntyre, there were once three ends of medical practice that was medicine's aim since Hippocrates until this time. The first was to stave off the patient's death as long as possible. The second is to prevent the patient's suffering or physical disability as far as possible. And the third is to promote the patient's general health and physical well being. What McIntyre argues is that with this shift in focus from infectious disease to chronic conditions, these three ends are no longer congruent with one another. Sometimes prescribing chemotherapy, as we know, may continue life, but also prolong suffering. Also, as we medical students of the relative future from the time of the article know, public health, even psychosocial interactions with the body, is now more increasingly emphasized and taught. For McIntyre, this makes medicine's crisis an avenue for it to become philosophical. Part 2. Here, McIntyre shifts focus to ethics proper. Modern philosophy at that point had its own kind of crisis going on. There were Kantians, duty ethics, utilitarians, and contract theorists out there, and all were preoccupied with rules and justification. And they all don't agree with each other. Even within utilitarianism, rule utilitarians would contend with act utilitarians, that both of them fight with Kant, etc. He does give a caveat, though, that in ancient philosophy and with Aristotle, there were no rules of any sort. Ethics was about the good for man, insofar as he is a citizen of the polis or city. But as far as modern ethics is concerned, there has been no satisfactory account of the status of the rules, no commonly accepted court of appeal in moral philosophy. Part 3. Here it's clear that McIntyre is trying to show that there's not really anything that ethics' problems have that medical ethics didn't already have, just less. The problem of medical ethics, he says, appear as a series of dilemmas in which moral agents look for good reasons to give weight and authority to one rule rather than another in situations of conflict. Here he gives three examples, but for brevity, I'll describe the third one only. Read the whole paper if you're interested. So, he puts it here. 3. A retired impoverished widower whose only remaining interest in life is his job as a driver of a school bus goes to his physician for his annual checkup and learns that he has a heart condition of some seriousness. The physician tells him that there's a high chance that he will have a heart attack, that he must stop driving the school bus. The patient refuses to do this. What should the physician do? So McIntyre comments the physician has to choose between respecting the rule that ordains confidentiality between physician and patient and the rule that prescribes whatever action will prevent possible imminent harm to innocent human life, especially that of children. And this seems to set up a genuine dilemma. An agent in each type of case considers what to do on a particular occasion and has no means of deciding between the rules. Modern moral philosophy for McIntyre has no answers or any grounds for giving some rules preference over others when they conflict with one another. Part 4. Here, McIntyre wants to step back from the dilemma and first posit if the local school board insisted on mandatory annual medical examinations by a physician appointed by it for all its bus drivers, the problem for the physician would never arise. The point being that a simple change in institutional arrangements would so alter the relationship of physician to patient, would so alter the physician's role that the circumstances which created the conflict of rules would be eliminated. And this is where McIntyre posits his two theses. The first one is wherever we are confronted with an insoluble dilemma, we should not try to solve it, we should try to prevent it arising. He comments if we do not know how to choose between rules, it does not follow that we do not know how to choose between types of institutional arrangement. We cannot eliminate moral problems, but by altering our institutional arrangements, we can choose what types of problems to have. Politics, in the Aristotelian sense, precedes ethics, just as Aristotle has said it in. His second thesis is this: rules are less fundamental than roles and relationships. That is the context which roles and relationships provide, which alone makes sense of rules. He put it in a quite witty way. And he comments roles and relationships themselves acquire elucidation in terms of goods. So medicine has two goods: one, the good of the patient whose life, health, and well being are at stake, and the second are the goods achieved by, as McIntyre says, that extension of human creative powers which the history of medicine embodies. In other words, being good at medicine and its art, that's a good in itself, being a skilled uh, prognosticator, diagnostician, treatment provider. But McIntyre argues the first has priority over the second. The measure of excellence in medical achievement lies in the ends in the good of the patient. In light of these two theses, the solution in which McIntyre finds in ethics comes in the form of a question, actually. In what relationship must the patient stand to the physician in order for the goods of medicine to be rightly ordered? To answer it at all, we need to bring up on the scene several additional concepts to specify types of possible relationship. And surprisingly, there may be more than one satisfactory answer to it. McIntyre, as you can see, wants to go old school. Back to Aristotle, particularly what he said about virtue. He says if you read Aristotle, you wouldn't be surprised by virtues such as courage or self restraint. But you'd be very surprised when friendship turns out, at least on his view, to be a virtue, and a virtue as fundamental as justice. To a friend, you are tied by your concerns for goods that are both his and yours, and his concern for the same goods. To a stranger, you have no ties at all. You do not even necessarily share any conception of goods. With a friend, you share the duties, obligations, and other moral constraints imposed by the authority of the goods you mutually recognize. But with a stranger, you initially share nothing, and whatever arises between you will necessarily rest, if prudent, on enforceable contracts, and if you're imprudent, on force or seduction. But modern moral philosophy books, McIntyre argues, never mentions friends or strangers. They are indeed categories excluded by abstract characteristics of the moral agent. So we go back to the question: in what relationship must the patient stand to the physician in order for the goods of medicine to be rightly ordered? McIntyre says either as friends or as strangers. And the reasoning for this is fascinating, and I encourage you to read this part. But to summarize, since it's already long, he says until we systematically choose to define the physician's role in terms of one alternative form of relationship or the other, friend, stranger, we shall have no way of putting the variety of moral rules which contend for our allegiance in any sort of order. And this aligns with what he was saying. He says, and this is interesting, the problems of medical ethics, therefore, are secondary to problems of medical organization. And problems of medical organization turn out to have a crucial moral dimension. For insofar as choices between forms of organization have implications for role definition, they at least partially determine moral problems we will encounter. And he concludes, but if ethics as it is studied in this country is ever to be reformed, it will, I am quite certain, be because medical ethics will have led the way. And this should not surprise us. Hippocrates said long ago that philosophy has more to learn from medicine than medicine from philosophy. That's the end of the paper. And I think for us medical students, especially in the context we're in today, especially here in the Philippines, which you can kind of see that the shift of that McIntyre is talking about, well, ponder it yourself, is has the shift already occurred? Or are we still in battling infectious diseases? And philosophically, we can think about um, this emphasis that medicine has. It's closer, it seems, to the human person, especially the human person who suffers. And that's why I think that ethics has a lot to learn from medical ethics. And medical ethics, in a way, is kind of like old school Aristotle, as McIntyre was saying. Um, so, while we think about medical ethics, especially in the context of our medical education, I mean, if you've gone this far, it is somewhat interesting to you. So, I hope this helps in your journey. Happy Philosophy Friday, and for the Wild Six, good luck for your exam on Monday. For everybody else, c'est la vie. God bless.